Now for something completely different. I'm going to show you a way to transfer images onto your fabric. We're still going to use the inkjet printer, but we're not going to print directly on the fabric, and that means we can use larger pieces of fabric. We could even do these on clothing. I have some samples here. These images were all done with this method, which the long name for it is image transfers from a non-absorbent surface. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you. These 3 flowers were all done by printing on a piece of plastic from the computer, from an image that I had scanned into the computer and then altered. This part back here was actually done by putting Oregon grape leaves right on the scanner, scanning the image and copying it straight onto the plastic and then transferring onto the fabric. I'm going to do a really quick demonstration just to give you the basic idea. This is an image of a flower that I scanned into the computer. This is pretty much what it looked like when I started out. For the transfer, I wanted something a little bit more vibrant, so I switched it to red, and I'm going to print that on a piece of plastic. And in this case, unlike printing directly on fabric, I want to have less ink on it, so I'm going to select text. I'm going to dampen my fabric, put the wet ink down onto the dampened fabric, and burnish the back of it. And the wet ink transfers onto the fabric. And after it transfers, it's just the same as if you had printed onto the fabric as far as the permanence. You do get a print that isn't quite as detailed as you get from printing directly on the fabric, but the advantage is that you can do it on any size fabric. There are several tools that you need for this. They are very inexpensive. I like combs for burnishers because they are slightly arched, very smooth. You can give a wide, broad rub with your burnishing, or you can use the end of it and just do a very small area. The spritzers, I buy cologne bottles at the dollar store, empty out the cologne, and they give you a really excellent, fine water mist on your work. The most important thing is the kind of plastic that you're going to work on. And I use transparency material that is made for overhead projectors, and it's made for laser printers or laser copiers. So what you get is a perfectly smooth, clear piece of fairly heavy plastic that cannot accept inkjet ink. It's intended for toner-based purposes where heat is going to bond your image on. So when you print it in an inkjet printer, the ink just sits there, and that's what we want for this technique. They make transparency material for inkjet printers, and that's not what you want to use for this particular technique. Inkjet transparency material has one very shiny side, that's the back side, and then the side that you're supposed to print on has a tooth to it. And it is especially formulated to take the inkjet ink and have it soak in. And that's not what we want for this technique. So the basic idea is very simple. There are variables. One of them is how wet you get your fabric. Another one is what kind of fabric you're using, whether it's a rough weave or a very fine weave, whether it's thin enough for the ink to sink right in. And I have a piece I can show you that will show the difference between lots of ink and just a little bit of ink. I have a piece here that shows the different amounts of ink that I can put onto the plastic to transfer with different settings in my computer. So the very first one is actually draft, and you get a lot of detail with that, but it's very light. So in order to get as dark a print as I've got here, I had to layer several transfers, one on top of another. When you go to the next setting, which is text, it gives you more ink on your piece of plastic, but you've lost a little bit of the detail. The next setting, text and photo, you're starting to pool the ink where you're getting a much heavier coating, and you can see when you go on to photo that you've lost a lot of the detail, and when you go to best photo, it's really just pooling in different areas. So you can get interesting effects using this, but probably using text or even draft is the best way to go to get detail. So how much ink is on your piece of plastic is one of the variables, and then another one is how wet you get your fabric that you're going to print onto. I'm going to do another flower onto the same piece of fabric, but this time I'm really going to soak it, and you'll be able to see what happens then. I just printed this, and now I'm going to put a lot of water onto this piece of fabric. When you see me checking it like this, most of the time it means I'm checking to make sure that it's just a little bit damp. But this time I'm checking to make sure that I've really soaked it. I'm going to put the flower down and burnish it. So you can see how soft the colors are on the second print where I really soaked the fabric. On the first one, where the fabric was just a little bit damp, it didn't quite make a complete image, but you have some nice texture on it and you have more detail. So it all depends on the effect that you're looking for. And this can be used, this technique can be used for lots of different purposes. I'm going to do one more print of the same flower, and I'm going to put it right on top of the first one so that you can see how easy it is to match up the images if you're going to layer them. So here's another print of the original flower, and I'm going to just spritz lightly where I printed it before, or where I transferred it before. Just get it a little bit damp. Now, this is the fun part. Okay, you can put it down exactly where you had it before, or of course you could offset it a little bit if you want to. But because you're working with clear plastic, you have that capability. There. So when I burnish it, it's going to make the print darker, but I shouldn't lose too much detail. After you have finished making a print, you can reuse the plastic. All you need to do is take a rag and your spritzer, spray it a little bit, and just wipe the extra ink right off. You don't want to let it sit overnight before you wipe the ink off, because the Epsom Dura-Brite inks are pigment-based inks that will dry, and by the next day it's going to be not just a matter of spritzing a little bit and wiping, it's going to be really hard work to get that image off. There. Now I can put this right back into the printer. This picture was printed on silk, and this picture is a transfer from the same image. So you can see that there's way more detail in the printed one than in the transfer. So if you want something with a lot of detail, then probably printing right on the fabric is the way to go. If you want something on a larger piece of fabric, then this is definitely the right method for you. This is an example of a piece that I put onto a large piece of fabric, and in this case you can actually see some of the straight edges where the individual pieces fit together when I transferred it all onto the fabric. Here's another piece that I scanned some cherry tomatoes and transferred it piece by piece. In this case, there aren't any straight edges that show you that it was done piece by piece. This is a test piece that I did on an old piece of linen because I was intending to do a figure on a vintage embroidered tablecloth. I wanted to show you this one because it's a good example of layering several variations of the same image on top of itself. So I have the whole face, and I've done a couple of transfers, and then I went back and in Photoshop I made the eyes and the nose and the mouth. I made the image very contrasty and printed it darker, and then went back and transferred that on top of the face that I already had. So the finished piece is done on a piece of embroidered tablecloth and then has some other embroidered linens added to it. The figure here is image transfer, but the doll and some of the elements on the other side and the playing card in back of her were all scanned on a 3-in-1 and then printed in the inkjet printer.